In the spring of 1896, beneath 40 feet of Mesopotamian soil, archaeologists working for the University of Pennsylvania's Babylonian expedition uncovered something that would challenge every assumption about why religion exists. The fragment measured 13 centimetres long, 10 wide, less than 2 centimetres thick, clay baked hard by ancient fire. Its surface was covered in wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay 40 centuries ago. The tablet carried the catalogue number CBS 1673. It sat in storage at the University of Pennsylvania Museum for decades before scholars fully understood what they were reading. When they did, they found something unexpected. This wasn't a hymn, it wasn't a prayer, it was a record of procedure, of divine beings making decisions, implementing plans, establishing systems, and at the centre of that procedure was the deliberate creation of what we would call religion, temples, priesthood, ritual, kingship, descended from heaven. The tablet describes events after a great flood, gods convening, a decision being reached, then, methodically, the establishment of cities under the protection of specific deities, Eridu assigned to Enki, god of the subterranean waters, Bad Tibira to the divine lady Inanna, Larak to Pabalsag, Sipar to the sun god Utu, Shurupak to Sud, not mythology, documentation, each city, each god, each assignment recorded as fact from the Sumerian perspective. The text then describes how Zisudra, the flood survivor, receives eternal life and a specific role, not as reward, as function. He becomes an intermediary, a bridge, and around him a structure begins to form, the architecture of what every civilization since has called religion. Before we continue, a question for you, wherever you are. What time is it where you're listening? Early morning before the world wakes? Late at night when thoughts drift? Leave a comment with your location and time. Knowing you're out there, scattered across the planet, considering these ancient questions together, matters. This isn't just information, it's inquiry. And inquiry thrives in community. The scholars who first studied CBS 1673 assumed they were reading myth, symbolic stories explaining why temples existed, why kings claimed divine authority, why priests performed rituals. Mythology, after all, is how ancient people made sense of their world. Except the Sumerians didn't write like people inventing explanations. They wrote like people recording events. Their king lists documented rulers with precision. Their administrative texts tracked grain shipments, labour allocations, legal disputes. Their astronomical observations demonstrated mathematical sophistication that wouldn't be matched for millennia. And when they wrote about the Anunnaki, those beings they described as descending from the heavens, as possessing vast knowledge, as establishing the first cities, they used the same documentary tone, the same formulaic precision, the same insistence on names, dates, locations, procedures. What if they weren't creating mythology? What if they were preserving memory? CBS 10673 sits in a climate-controlled vault now, protected from the very humidity that kept it intact for 4,000 years beneath the water table of ancient Mesopotamia. The clay is slightly curved, part of what was once a larger tablet. The cuneiform is clean, pressed by a skilled scribe who knew the old language, Sumerian, already ancient when this copy was made in the Old Babylonian period around 1650 BC, but preserving a tradition that reached back much further. The tablet is cool to the touch, surprisingly light. The wedges catch shadows differently depending on the angle of light. In the right illumination, you can see the scribe's technique, the way the stylus was rotated slightly to create the wedge head, the consistent pressure, the careful spacing. This was important information, information worth preserving with precision. The fragment contains 6 columns of text, 3 on each side, about 260 lines in the complete tablet, of which portions survive. And within those surviving portions, a framework emerges. The gods had been angry, humanity had become too numerous, too loud. The decision was made to reduce mankind through catastrophe. But one god, Enki, warns one man, Ziusudra. Instructions are given. A boat is built. The flood comes. 7 days and 7 nights the storm rages. Then it passes. The sun returns. Ziusudra emerges and offers sacrifice. And here, in the aftermath, something shifts. The gods enlil and grant Ziusudra eternal life and life like a god. But more than that, they establish something new. A system, a structure, cities with assigned deities, kings chosen by divine decree, temples as points of connection. The question that emerges from CBS 1673, the question that connects to dozens of other tablets found across ancient Mesopotamia, is this: why? If the Anunnaki possess the power the texts ascribe to them, control over the elements, vast lifespans, the ability to grant kingship from heaven, why create religion? Why not rule directly? Why establish intermediaries, build temples, formalize priesthoods, encode knowledge into ritual? The answer might not be about control, it might be about distance. The text suggests that after the flood, something changed in the relationship between gods and humans. Direct interaction decreased. The Anunnaki still determined destinies, still held authority, but they withdrew from daily management. Religion, the entire apparatus of temple, ritual, kingship, priesthood, emerges in the tablets not as a tool to control humanity, but as a framework to manage a relationship that had become more remote. If this reading has merit, then religion, as the Sumerians documented, it wasn't invented to manipulate primitive people. It was created to maintain connection across an increasing distance. The temple wasn't a place to worship, it was an embassy. The priest wasn't an interpreter of mysteries, he was a trained operator maintaining procedures. The king wasn't claiming divinity, he was functioning as an appointed administrator. And the rituals weren't about belief, they were about preservation, keeping alive a system that had been deliberately established for a specific reason in a specific moment. That moment, according to CBS 1673 and the constellation of texts that surround it, came after the flood, after a reset, after humanity's near extinction and the gods' decision to rebuild, but differently, with structure, with separation, with intermediaries. The clay tablet in its vault doesn't answer all questions, it opens them. And as we trace through the network of Sumerian texts that document this framework, the king lists that record kingship's descent from heaven, the me texts that catalogue the gifts of civilization, the temple hymns that map the sacred geography, the wisdom literature that preserves pre-flood. Knowledge, a picture emerges that's stranger and more systematic than mythology suggests. The Sumerians wrote as if they were documenting the establishment of an administrative system, one that had a beginning, one that was built for a reason. And if we take their texts seriously, not as myth but as their record of reality, then we have to ask, what was that reason? That question leads into the oldest library humanity ever assembled. #when kingship descended from heaven. The Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University houses one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. Its catalogue number is 1923-444, but scholars know it by a different name, the Weld Blundell Prism. It's a baked clay prism, 8-sided, standing about 8 inches tall, covered entirely in neat columns of cuneiform script. The text begins with a statement that has puzzled and fascinated researchers for a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. Not after humans developed kingship, not after people chose leaders, after kingship descended from heaven, as if it were an object, a technology, something that came from elsewhere and was granted, not invented. The Weld Blundell Prism was written around 2000 B during the Isin Lhasa period, but it documents a much older tradition. It lists rulers stretching back into what it calls antediluvian times, the period before the flood. 8 cities, each with kings who reigned for extraordinary lengths, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Then comes the simple notation, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Modern scholarship often dismisses these figures as symbolic, the early sections as legendary, the whole document as an attempt by later Mesopotamian scribes to create an origin story that justified their own ruler's authority. But the Weld-Blundell prism doesn't read like propaganda. It reads like a catalogue, a careful, systematic record of who held authority, in which city, for how long, in what order. The scribe who composed it worked from sources, earlier king lists from individual cities, temple records, administrative archives. The prism synthesizes those sources into a unified chronology with a specific purpose, to show that legitimate kingship in Mesopotamia had a single source, a continuous line of transmission, and that source was divine. Kingship descended from heaven, not once, but twice in the text framework. Once before the flood, when it was in Eredug with the ruler Alulim, once after the flood, when it was re-established in Kish with the ruler Gore. The flood acts as a break, a reset, but not a complete erasure. The system continues. The source remains the same. Heaven grants kingship to earth, and the record of that granting matters enough that scribes copied it, preserved it, updated it for 1,000 years. The Sumerians emerged into historical visibility around 3500 BCC in southern Mesopotamia, in the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where those waters approach the Persian Gulf. They called their land Ki Engir, which means the land of the civilized lords. The word Sumer comes to us through Akkadian, the Semitic language that would eventually dominate the region, but the Sumerians themselves were neither Semitic nor Indo-European. Their language stands alone, unrelated to any known family. They appear in the archaeological record fully formed, with cities, writing, complex administration, astronomical knowledge, and a coherent mythology. Or perhaps not mythology, perhaps memory. The cities they built rose on platforms above the marsh and plain. Eridu, the oldest, where Enki's temple stood beside the sweet waters of the Abzu. Uruk, where Inanna's temple Ea reached toward heaven. Where the moon god Nana held court. Nippur, the religious centre, home to Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. Each city possessed its own character, its own deity, its own administrative structure, but all acknowledged a common framework, a shared cosmology, a unified sense that civilization itself had been gifted to them by beings they called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian texts not as metaphors or personifications of natural forces, but as entities with specific identities, relationships, jurisdictions. Enlil, Lord of the Wind, who decrees fates in Nippur. Enki, Lord of the Abzu, Master of Wisdom and Magic, Creator of Humanity. An, the Sky Father, distant but supreme. Inanna, Goddess of Love and War, who stole the Mi, the divine decrees, from Enki and brought them to her city of Uruk. Ninhursag, the Mother Goddess, who moulded humans from clay mixed with divine blood. These are not simple nature deities. The texts describe them making decisions, disagreeing, forming councils, implementing plans. They possess technology. Enki travels in a boat called the Ibex of the Abzu that moves through both water and underground chambers. Inanna flies between heaven and earth. Enlil possesses objects of power that control weather and fertility. The texts use the term Mi to describe not just decrees or concepts, but specific attributes of civilization that could be possessed, transferred, stolen, kingship, priesthood, weaponcraft, writing, music, sexual intercourse, the destruction of cities, the making of decisions. And according to every text that addresses the question, these fundamental building blocks of civilization, came from the gods. Humanity received them. We did not invent them. The Weld-Blundell prism documents, who held the authority to wield these powers. Its king list moves methodically through dynasties, Kish, then Uruk, then Ur, then Awan, then Kish again. Sometimes the kingship transfers peacefully, often it moves through conquest, but always the text emphasizes the kingship is in one place at a time. Legitimate authority is singular, unified, traceable. This becomes important when we consider what the prism is documenting. Not history in our modern sense, though archaeology has confirmed many of the rulers and cities it names. Not pure mythology, though it includes elements modern scholars consider legendary. Instead, it's documenting something the Sumerians considered both historical and sacred, the line of authorized administration, the record of who held the mandate of heaven. That phrase, mandate of heaven, comes from Chinese political philosophy, but the concept appears independently in Sumer. The king ruled not because he seized power, but because kingship was granted to him by the gods. And that granting had to be legitimate, traceable, part of an unbroken chain reaching back to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven. Why did this matter? Because if kingship was a technology, a granted authority rather than a human innovation, then maintaining its legitimacy required maintaining its connection to the source. The king wasn't just a military strong man who claimed divine blessing after the fact. He was an appointed administrator whose authority derived from his place in a system that predated him and would continue after him. He stood in for the gods. He enacted their decisions on earth. He was, in the language of the texts, their shepherd, their tenant farmer, their appointed agent. The Sumerian word for king is lugal, literally great man or big man, but the king's titles went far beyond this. He was farmer of Enlil, tenant farmer of Nana, beloved husband of Inanna, depending on which deity granted him authority. He was shepherd of the black-headed people, the Sumerian term for humanity. He built temples, maintained canals, administered justice, led armies, performed rituals, but all these actions were understood as fulfilling a role, not wielding personal power. The World Blundell Prism lists 134 rulers across its history, from Alulim of Eridu before the flood to Sin-Magi of Essene around 1827 BCE, where the scribe's copy ends. Each entry follows a formula: name of ruler, sometimes his patronage or origin, length of reign, sometimes a brief note about his accomplishments. Etana, a shepherd who ascended to heaven, who consolidated all the lands, became king. He reigned 1,560 years. Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, the lord of Kulaba, reigned 126 years. Some of these figures, Gilgamesh especially, we know from epic literature, but the king list treats them all the same way, as historical rulers who held legitimate authority. The extraordinary reign lengths in the early periods might indicate something other than literal solar years, perhaps a different system of reckoning time, perhaps reigns of dynasties rather than individuals, perhaps an attempt by later scribes to fill chronological gaps. But the consistency of the tradition is remarkable. For 1,000 years, scribes maintained and updated this document, adding new rulers as they came to power, preserving the record of authority's transmission. What does this tell us about religion's purpose in Sumer? If kingship descended from heaven, if legitimate authority came from the gods, then the entire apparatus of state administration becomes something different from what we typically assume about ancient kingdoms. The king isn't inventing the claim that gods support him. He's operating within a framework where divine authorization is the definition of legitimate rule. And that framework, according to the texts, was established deliberately after the flood as a new way of organizing the relationship between heaven and earth. Before the flood, the World Blundell Prism suggests, kingship existed, but differently. The antediluvian rulers have those extraordinary reign lengths. The text offers little detail about their administrations. They rule, but the system seems less formalized. Then comes the flood, the reset, and afterward, when kingship descends from heaven again, it comes with structure. Post-flood kings have more reasonable reign lengths, though still often longer than modern lifespans. their accomplishments are noted more frequently. The administrative machinery becomes visible, temple building, wall construction, warfare, conquest, the extension of irrigation systems. The king becomes busier, more engaged with the physical infrastructure of civilization, as if the role had expanded or the god's direct involvement had contracted, requiring human administration to do more. The same pattern appears across multiple Sumerian tablets. Direct divine intervention is common in antediluvian stories and immediate post-flood narratives, but as the king lists progress forward in time, divine action becomes more mediated. The gods still determine fates, still grant kingship, still receive offerings, and communicate through omens. But they do so at one remove, through intermediaries, through the very system of religion that the texts describe being established after the flood. This raises a possibility that the Well-Blundell prism doesn't state explicitly, but which its structure implies. What if religion, as the Sumerians documented it, was created not to make humans subservient, but to make them capable of functioning with less direct divine oversight, capable of maintaining cosmic order through ritual rather than requiring constant divine intervention, capable of self-administration under appointed representatives? The framework would look like this. Before the flood, the gods managed humanity more directly. The Atrahasis epic, which we'll examine more closely, suggests humanity was created to relieve the gods of labour, to dig canals, maintain irrigation, grow food. But as humanity multiplied, the noise, the chaos, the complexity became overwhelming. The gods decided on a drastic solution: reduce humanity through catastrophe. One god, Enki, subverts this decision by saving one human and his household. After the catastrophe, a new arrangement is needed. The solution: create a system where humans could be managed at a distance, grant them kingship, authorise leaders who would maintain order, establish temples, physical points of contact where communication could be formalised, institute priesthood, trained specialists who would maintain procedures, codify rituals, repeatable actions that would maintain cosmic harmony without requiring divine presence, transfer some of the me, the powers of civilization, so humans could function more independently. Religion becomes infrastructure, not a method to control primitive people through superstition, but a systematic framework allowing advanced beings to withdraw from daily management while maintaining overall authority. The king administers in their name. The priest performs procedures they established. The temple serves as their embassy. The ritual recreates patterns they originally enacted. And humanity, from this perspective, isn't being deceived. The Sumerians knew they were performing procedures established by the Anunnaki. They recorded it explicitly. The entire system's legitimacy depended on that connection. When a new king took power, he didn't claim divine authority on his own. He travelled to Nippur, city of Enlil, where priests confirmed that kingship had been granted to him from heaven. Without that confirmation, his rule remained questionable. The system policed itself, requiring authentication from the source. This is a very different picture of religion's origin than most modern theories propose. It suggests deliberate design, systematic implementation, a reason grounded not in human psychology or social control, but in the practical requirements of managing a relationship that had become too complex for direct governance. But if this framework was established, it had to be communicated. Humanity had to understand its role, the rules, the procedures. That knowledge had to be transferred, codified, preserved. Which brings us to the question of service and what humanity was actually created to do. Hashtag the problem of service. The British Museum houses a collection of tablets that tell one of the most disturbing creation stories ever recorded. Not disturbing because it's violent, though it is. Not disturbing because it describes gods in conflict, though it does. Disturbing because it states with perfect clarity and no apparent discomfort why humans exist: to serve the gods so the gods can rest. The text is called the Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian but preserving older Sumerian traditions. The most complete version dates to the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC, but the story it tells is demonstrably older. It begins not with humans, but with gods, young gods, lower-ranking gods, called the Igigi, digging canals. The work is backbreaking. The text describes 40 years of labour, digging the Tigris, digging the Euphrates, excavating the irrigation channels that would make the land between the rivers productive. The Igigi carry baskets of earth. Their hands blister. They grow increasingly resentful. Finally, they rebel. They burn their tools. They march on Enlil's dwelling at night. They surround his house and demand relief from their labour. Enlil, startled and angry, calls a council of the great gods. A solution must be found. The work is necessary. Civilization requires it. But the Igigi refuse to continue. Enki, the god of wisdom, proposes an alternative: create a new being, something capable of performing the work, but not divine, something expendable, yet intelligent enough to handle complex tasks. The mother goddess, variously called Ninhursag or Belet Ili, agrees to the creation. She mixes clay with the flesh and blood of a slaughtered god, one of the rebel leaders, sacrificed to both punish rebellion and provide the divine spark necessary for intelligence. From this mixture, humans are moulded, 7 males and 7 females. The mould is set. The work of creation is complete. The text is explicit about purpose. Let him bear the yoke, the work of Enlil. Let man carry the load of the gods. The Akkadian word for this work is dullu, toil, labour, imposed service. Humanity is created as a workforce, not as companions, not as worshippers, not as children of the gods, as workers, to perform tasks the young gods no longer wanted to perform. This is profoundly different from other creation traditions. The biblical Genesis describes humanity created in God's image, given dominion over the earth, blessed and told to be fruitful. Greek mythology has humans shaped by Prometheus, with pity and cunning, granted fire stolen from Olympus. But Atrahasis describes humans engineered for a specific function, assigned a role before their first breath, created because gods wanted rest. The question this raises, however, is what service actually meant to the Sumerians. Was it simply agricultural labour, tending fields, digging canals, building infrastructure? That's what the Atrahasis epic initially suggests. Humanity replaces the Igigi in the physical work of maintaining civilization. But as the epic continues, service takes on additional dimensions. Humans are to make offerings, to perform rituals, to maintain temples, to provide sustenance for the gods. This is where the Mesopotamian concept of religion begins to look very strange to modern eyes. The gods, according to Sumerian theology, required food, not metaphorically. The texts describe daily offerings of bread, beer, meat, dates, oil. Statues of gods in temples were dressed, fed, and cared for as if they were living beings. The rituals weren't symbolic worship, they were maintenance. The temple staff functioned as household servants for the divine image, which was understood to be the god's physical presence on earth. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, elaborates on this system. After the god, Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the ordered cosmos from her corpse, the gods gather to reward him. They grant him supreme authority, give him the Tablet of Destinies, and establish him as king of the gods. In gratitude, Marduk announces he will create humanity to serve the gods so they can be at leisure. But he goes further. He will build Babylon with its great temple Esagila as his dwelling place. Humanity will maintain this temple. They will perform the rituals that keep cosmic order intact. Here, service becomes more complex. Yes, humans perform physical labour, but they also maintain the structures, temples, through which divine power operates on earth. They perform the rituals, offerings, invocations, festivals that sustain the relationship between heaven and earth. And they provide something the texts describe as necessary for the gods. they make them present. The Sumerian and Akkadian words translated as temple don't mean place of worship in our modern sense. The Sumerian means house. Enlil's temple in Nippur was Kur, the mountain house. Enki's temple in Eridu was Abzu, the Abzu house. Inanna's temple in Uruk was Anna, the house of heaven. These were understood as literal dwellings. The god resided there. The temple wasn't where you went to think about the god, it was where the god actually was, in physical form through the cult statue. Maintaining that presence required constant work. The statue had to be fed, clothed, bathed, honoured. Temple precincts had to be kept pure. Offerings had to be made at appointed times. Festivals had to be celebrated according to precise schedules aligned with astronomical observations. None of this was optional. The text described cosmic consequences when rituals lapsed, drought, plague, military defeat, the favour of the gods withdrawn. But here's the crucial point. The Sumerians didn't describe this as arbitrary. The gods didn't demand service out of vanity or tyranny. They required it because the system operated that way. The rituals weren't about worship in the sense of praising powerful beings. They were operational procedures, actions that maintained cosmic function. The offerings weren't gifts to please capricious deities. They were energy inputs into a system that required those inputs to operate. Think of it this way. If the temples were interfaces between heaven and earth, they needed to be powered. If the rituals were procedures that maintained order, they needed to be performed correctly. If the priests were technicians, they needed to follow protocols. And if humanity was created to fulfill this function, then service meant something closer to staffing an installation than slaving for masters. The Atrahasis epic continues past humanity's creation. Humans multiply, they fill the earth, and then something unexpected happens. They become too numerous, too loud. Their noise disturbs the god's rest. Enlil, in particular, grows increasingly irritated. He tries various solutions: disease, drought, famine. Each time Enki intervenes, teaching humans how to survive. Finally, Enlil proposes the ultimate solution: a flood, complete reset, end the noise permanently. But Enki objects. Humanity has been useful. They've performed their function. The problem isn't humanity itself, it's overpopulation. So Enki makes a compromise. He'll warn one human, Atrahasis, whose name means extremely wise, and that human will survive the flood with his household. After the catastrophe, humanity will be reconstituted, but with modifications. Women will have shorter fertile periods, some will be barren, infant mortality will be introduced, population will be naturally controlled. This is a very pragmatic solution to a management problem. And what follows the flood in the Atrahasis epic mirrors what we see in other Sumerian texts: a reorganization. After the flood, the relationship between gods and humans is restructured. Direct contact decreases, administrative layers are introduced. The system we call religion, temple, priesthood, kingship, ritual is formalized. Service continues, but mediated. Humans still maintain temples, perform rituals, make offerings, but now they do so through authorized specialists. Not everyone has access to the divine presence. Not everyone can perform the procedures. Knowledge becomes restricted, specialized, transmitted through initiation and training. The priesthood emerges not as an exploitative class claiming false authority, but as trained operators maintaining procedures the gods established. Similarly, kingship emerges as an administrative layer. The king doesn't claim to be a god. Sumerian and Akkadian texts are clear on this distinction, but he is the god's appointed representative. He ensures temples are maintained, rituals performed, cosmic order preserved. He judges disputes according to divinely established law. He leads armies with divine blessing. He builds and maintains the infrastructure through which civilization operates. From this perspective, the service humanity was created to provide isn't slavery. It's a role in a larger system. Humans maintain the earthly side of a relationship that extends between realms. They keep the interfaces functional. They perform procedures that were demonstrated once by divine action and then encoded into repeatable rituals. They operate as the ground crew for a civilization whose architects are no longer present for daily management. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If humans were created to serve, how much autonomy did the Sumerians believe they actually had? Were they just organic machines performing programmed functions? Or was there something more complex in the relationship? The answer appears in a concept unique to Mesopotamian thought, but so fundamental to their civilization that it appears in hundreds of texts: the me. The me defies simple translation. It's been rendered as divine powers, divine decrees, cultural norms, cosmic principles, but none of these capture what the Sumerian texts describe. The me aren't abstract concepts. They're transferable. They can be stolen, granted, accumulated, lost. Different gods possess different me. Cities can acquire more me and become more powerful. And crucially, some me can be given to humans. The most detailed account of the me comes from a text describing how Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travels to Eridu to visit her father Enki. Enki, pleased by her visit, drinks heavily, and in his intoxication decides to gift her with the me. The text lists over 100 of them: supreme godship, the exalted crown, the throne of kingship, the lofty sceptre, the priestly office, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kindling of strife, the art of music, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leatherworker, the craft of the builder, wisdom, victory, counselling, judgment, decision-making. Inanna loads these me onto her boat and flees back to Uruk before Enki sobers up and realises what he's given away. When he does realise, he sends his servant Isimud to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes. The me reach Uruk. The city acquires these powers and becomes great. This story functions as political mythology, explaining Uruk's prominence, celebrating Inanna's cunning. But it also describes something important about how the Sumerians understood civilization. The me aren't human inventions. They come from the gods. But once given, they become part of the human repertoire. Humans can wield them, can develop expertise in them, can teach them to the next generation. This is knowledge transmission, not knowledge generation. And it suggests that service to the gods included operating these powers, these me, on earth. Humans didn't invent kingship, priesthood, music, metallurgy, judgment. They received these as gifts. But having received them, they could exercise them. The service was maintaining and using these gifts according to the purposes for which they were granted. Religion, in this framework, becomes the formal structure through which humans continued to access the me. The temple housed not just a divine statue, but the accumulated me of that city. The priest didn't just perform rituals, he wielded specific me related to his function. The king didn't just rule, he exercised the me of kingship granted from heaven. And the rituals themselves were enactments of the me, repeatable procedures that maintained their operation. But if humans were created to serve, given powers to serve effectively, taught procedures to serve correctly, there's still a question of mechanism. How did the system actually operate? What were the physical structures through which this divine-human relationship functioned? The answer is architecture. Specific architecture built to specific specifications, placed in specific locations. The temple system wasn't random, it was systematic. And in its systematization, we can see the outline of what the Sumerians believed they were maintaining. Hashtag the me, gifts or governance tools. In the storage vaults of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago sit hundreds of tablets from excavations at Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer. Among them are texts that catalogue something remarkable, the transferable building blocks of civilization itself. These aren't inventory lists of grain or records of land transactions. They're inventories of power, of capacities, authorities, technologies that the Sumerians believed could be possessed, accumulated, transferred, and lost. They called these powers the me. The concept has no parallel in Western thought. We understand abstract principles, justice, beauty, truth. We understand concrete skills, carpentry, medicine, agriculture. But the Sumerian me occupy a strange middle space. They're both concrete and abstract, both object and concept, both gift and responsibility. And according to every text that discusses them, they came from the gods. The longest catalogue of the me appears in the myth Inanna and Enki, where over 100 distinct me are named. But me appear throughout Sumerian literature. The temple hymns of Enheduanna, composed around 2300 BC by the high priestess of the moon god Nanna, describe different temples as possessing different me. Nippur's E-Kor temple held the me of supreme authority. Eridu's E-Abzu held the me of wisdom and sweet water. Uruk's E-Anna held the me of love, war, and the planet Venus. Each city's patron deity controlled specific me, and those me determined the city's character, prosperity, and influence. But what exactly were the me? The Sumerian language itself offers clues. The word is usually written with two cuneiform signs, me, which can mean being or essence, and which means house or temple. Some scholars argue the me were originally understood as divine attributes that could be housed in temples, made physically present through cult statues and ritual objects. Others suggest they were more like decrees or laws, established principles that structured reality itself. But the texts describe the me as more tangible than either interpretation suggests. In Inanna and Enki, the goddess literally loads the me onto her boat of heaven. She bundles them, ties them, carries them physically from Eridu to Uruk. When Enki tries to reclaim them, she holds them close, protects them, refuses to return them. They have weight, presence, the capacity to be possessed or lost. Consider what this implies. If the fundamental structures of civilization could be physically transferred, then civilization itself wasn't something humans invented, it was something humans received. The me for kingship, priesthood, legal judgment, temple building, metallurgy, music, agriculture, these came from the gods and were granted to humanity. Our role wasn't creation, it was stewardship. The list of me in Inanna and Enki is extraordinary in its specificity and scope. The me of godship, the me of the exalted and enduring crown, the me of the throne of kingship, the me of the lofty sceptre, the me of the noble shrine, the me of shepherdship, the me of kingship, the me of lasting ladyship, the me of the priestly office, the me of the divine office, the me of truth, the me of descent into the underworld, the me of ascent from the underworld, the me of the eunuch priests, the me of the holy priestesses, the me of sexual intercourse, the me of the kissing of the phallus, the me of prostitution, the me of the loud cry, the me of music, the me of eldership, the me of heroship, the me of power, the me of enmity, the me of straightforwardness, the me of the plundering of cities, the me of lamentation, the me of rejoicing, the me of deceit, the me of the rebel lands, the me of kindness, the me of moving about, the me of permanent dwelling, the me of the craft of the smith, the me of the craft of the leather worker, the me of the craft of the builder, the me of the craft of the basket weaver. The list continues. The me of wisdom, counsel, judgment, decision-making. The me of purification, bathing, anointing. The me of fear, terror, consternation. The me of making strife, setting fire, extinguishing fire. The me of assembling, dispersing. The me of procreation, fertility, desire. The me of falsehood, art, cult prostitution, the tavern, the alehouse. This isn't mythology in the usual sense. It's a systematic catalogue of everything that makes civilization possible, from the most exalted, kingship, judgment, divine authority, to the most practical, basket weaving, leatherworking, dwelling places, to the most visceral, sexuality, warfare, deception, joy, lamentation, and all of it according to the text, originated with the gods and was transferred to humanity. Why would divine beings create such a system? Why grant humans these capacities rather than simply commanding them to perform specific tasks? The answer might lie in what the me actually did. They weren't just permissions or abstract authorities, they were operational principles. When a human possessed the me of kingship, they could actually function as king, not because they claimed authority, but because they wielded the me that enabled kingship to work. When a priest possessed the me of the priestly office, they could perform rituals that produced actual results, not through magical thinking, but through procedures encoded in the me. Think of the me as something closer to software than law. They didn't just authorize activities, they enabled them, and like software, they required implementation. The me had to be instantiated, made present and active through specific actions in specific places. That's where temples came in. Each major Sumerian city was built around its central temple complex. These weren't just large buildings, they were installations. Nippur-Zi-Kur, Temple of Enlil, sat at the geographic centre of Sumer, elevated on an artificial platform that took generations to build. Uruk's ENR complex covered over 200 acres, with multiple temples, administrative buildings, workshops, storage facilities. Eridu's Iabzu was built directly over fresh water springs that the Sumerians believed connected to the subterranean ocean where Enki dwelt. The architecture wasn't arbitrary. Temple layouts followed specific patterns. The main sanctuary always faced east. The platform height corresponded to the deity's rank in the pantheon. The number of gates, courtyards, and inner chambers reflected sacred numbers associated with that god. Archaeological excavation has revealed that even when temples were rebuilt, and they were rebuilt frequently, with each new king trying to outdo his predecessors, the ground plan remained consistent. The architecture preserved a template. Why? Because the temple was where the me were housed, where they were made present and active. The god statue wasn't just a symbol. The Sumerians believed it was the god's physical manifestation on earth, and through it, the me associated with that god operated in the human realm. The temple was the interface, the point of connection, the place where divine power could be accessed according to established procedures. This is where religion begins to look less like worship and more like infrastructure. Consider what happened during a Sumerian ritual. The procedure was specific, purification of the participants, correct timing aligned with astronomical observations, specific offerings made in specific order, specific words spoken in specific cadences, specific gestures performed at specific moments. The ritual texts that survive are extraordinarily detailed. Nothing is left to interpretation. Every step is documented. Why such precision? Because the ritual was implementing the me. It was a procedure designed to produce a result, fertility for the fields, victory in battle, health for the king, prosperity for the city. And like any procedure, it only worked if performed correctly. The priest wasn't worshipping, he was operating. He had been trained in the procedure, initiated into the knowledge of how to implement the me through ritual action. The same principle applied to kingship. When a new king took power in Sumer, he didn't just seize authority, he travelled to Nippur, to Enlil's temple, where the high priest confirmed that Enlil had granted him the me of kingship. This wasn't political theatre, or rather it was political theatre because the Sumerians believed it was also metaphysically real. Without the me of kingship, you were just a strong man with an army. With the me, you were king, and your authority was legitimate, cosmic, part of the divine order. This system had profound implications. It meant that civilization wasn't something humans built from scratch. We didn't figure out kingship, law, temple worship, metallurgy, agriculture. We received them, and having received them, we were responsible for maintaining them. The me had to be preserved, transmitted to the next generation, implemented correctly according to the procedures that have been established. This is why the Sumerians were so concerned with tradition, with maintaining the old ways, with copying and preserving ancient texts, even when the language Sumerian itself was dying out. They weren't being conservative for the sake of tradition. They believed they were maintaining operational procedures. If you changed the ritual, it might not work. If you altered the temple architecture, the me might not be properly housed. If you deviated from the established patterns, you risked losing the connection to the source. And the source, according to every text, was the Anunnaki. The me didn't just exist in abstract form. They were associated with specific objects. The Tablet of Destinies, which we'll examine more closely, was a physical object that conferred the me of supreme authority. Whoever possessed it could decree fates for gods and humans. Inanna's me, loaded onto her boat, were tangible enough to be stolen. The crown of kingship, the sceptre, the divine robes, these weren't just symbols. They were understood as vessels for specific me. This creates a picture of civilization that's very different from the standard evolutionary narrative. Instead of humans gradually developing technologies and social structures through trial and error, the Sumerians describe a transfer. Knowledge came from the gods, skills were taught, systems were established, and humanity's role was to operate those systems, maintain those procedures, preserve that knowledge. But if this was the framework, it had to be taught. Someone had to train the priests in the rituals. Someone had to teach the kings how to exercise the me of kingship properly. Someone had to ensure the procedures were transmitted accurately across generations. That's where the architecture of intermediaries becomes crucial, because the me weren't just abstract powers. They were implemented through specific roles, in specific places, following specific procedures. And that implementation required a systematic infrastructure. The temple system of Sumer was that infrastructure. #the architecture of intermediaries. The ziggurat at Ur stands even now, 42 centuries after it was built. Restored partially by Saddam Hussein's archaeologists, it rises in 3 massive tiers of baked brick above the flat Mesopotamian plain. From the summit you can see for miles the modern city of Nasiriyah to the north, the desert to the west, the marshlands to the south. In ancient times, you would have seen something different. A city of perhaps 65,000 people, the river Euphrates flowing near the walls, fields of barley and date palms, irrigated by an intricate network of canals, and all around, the flat horizon broken only by other cities, each crowned with its own temple platform reaching toward heaven. The ziggurat was called Itme Nigur, house of the foundation platform of heaven and earth. It was the physical manifestation of a concept, the temple as connection point, as interface between realms. The base was earth, built by human hands from mud brick, the most common material in the alluvial plain where stone was scarce. The summit was heaven, where the god Nana descended to meet his priestess, where rituals were performed that only the initiated could witness, where the boundary between divine and human became permeable. But the ziggurat wasn't the only structure. It stood at the centre of a vast complex, the Nun Mak, the house of great princeship, an enclosed courtyard where lesser rituals were performed, the Dublal Mak, the house of the great hanging tablet, where economic records were kept and administrative decisions made, the Nungur, where Nana's high priestess lived, the Gipar, residences for other priestesses, workshops for metalworkers, weavers, potters, all producing goods for temple offerings and trade, granaries holding tribute and tax, kitchens preparing the daily meals for the god's statue, housing for hundreds of temple staff. This wasn't a church, it was a complex institution, part embassy, part administrative centre, part economic engine, part interface between the visible and invisible worlds. And Ur was just one city. Every major Sumerian settlement had similar complexes. Nippur's Kur was even larger, because Nippur held Enlil, the supreme god whose authority even other gods acknowledged. Uruk's Eonar covered over 200 acres and had been in continuous use for over 1,500 years by the time the Sumerian civilization reached its peak. Eridu's Iabzu sat at the southern edge of the Sumerian world, where fresh water springs bubbled up through limestone, the physical manifestation of the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of sweet water over which Enki ruled. The temple architecture followed patterns that were preserved for millennia. Archaeological excavation has revealed that when temples were destroyed by war, fire, flood, or simply the passage of time, they were rebuilt on exactly the same footprint. The ground plan was sacred, the orientation was fixed, the proportions were maintained. Even when building techniques improved, even when new materials became available, even when new rulers wanted to leave their mark, the essential template persisted. Why? Because the architecture wasn't decorative, it was functional. The temple was the physical instantiation of the me associated with that place and that deity. It had to be built correctly for the me to operate properly. Consider the most detailed temple description we have, the Ninnu, Temple of Ningirsu in the city of Lagash. Around 2100 BC, the ruler Gudea received divine instructions in a dream to rebuild this temple. He commissioned a series of inscriptions documenting the entire process, the longest autobiographical text to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. The inscriptions describe how Gudea consulted omens to determine the proper time to begin, how he purified the site, how he sourced materials from across the known world, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Meluhar, possibly the Indus Valley, copper from the Zagros Mountains, diorite from Maganaman, carnelian from Marhas High, how he employed specialized craftsmen, carpenters, metalworkers, stone carvers, each guild with its own skills passed down through apprenticeship, how the dimensions were calculated according to divine instruction, how specific rooms had specific functions, the place of soothing, the place of washing, the place of prayer, the place of destinies. The final temple was, according to Gudea's inscriptions, so magnificent that when Ningirsu took his seat within it, the other gods assembled to marvel. But the magnificence wasn't for human glorification. Every detail served function. The temple had to be a worthy dwelling for the god, yes, but more than that, it had to facilitate the god's operations on earth. The place of destinies was where Ningirsu would decree fates for the coming year. The place of prayer was where the king would communicate with the god. The offering tables had to be the correct height, made of the correct materials, positioned in the correct locations for the rituals to work. This attention to detail pervades Sumerian temple construction. It wasn't enough to build a house for the god. The house had to enable the god's presence and function, and that function was specific to serve as the point of contact through which divine authority operated on earth. Now consider who worked in these temples. The priesthood wasn't a single office. It was a complex hierarchy of specialized roles, each requiring different training, each wielding different aspects of the me. At the top were the En and the Sangu, the high priest and high priestess. The En was often the city's ruler or a close relative, someone who embodied both political and religious authority. The high priestess was frequently the king's daughter, sent to serve the god for life. These weren't ceremonial positions. The En performed the most sacred rituals, including the annual sacred marriage ceremony, where the king or high priest ritually married the goddess, represented by her priests, to ensure fertility for the land. The Sangu managed the temple's vast economic operations, fields, flocks, workshops, trade missions. Below them were multiple orders of priests, each with specific functions. The Gudu priests performed daily offerings to the god statue. The Ib priests specialized in purification rituals, using water, fire and incantations to cleanse people, places and objects before sacred ceremonies. The Lumar priestesses sang lamentations. The Naru musicians played instruments during rituals, lyres, drums, flutes, each with sacred associations. The Aipu priests specialized in exorcism and healing, diagnosing which demon or curse afflicted a patient and performing the correct procedure to remove it. The Baru priests were diviners, reading omens in the entrails of sacrificed sheep, the patterns of oil on water, the flight of birds, the movements of celestial bodies. Each role required years of training. Apprentice priests learned not just theology but practical skills, how to slaughter an animal correctly for sacrifice, how to prepare specific oils and incenses, how to read cuneiform scriptracy was rare and precious, how to calculate the calendar, how to recognize the symptoms of various diseases, how to identify astronomical events, how to perform the gestures, and speak the words of ritual with exact precision. This was technical knowledge, procedural knowledge, the kind of knowledge that doesn't emerge from philosophical speculation, but from instruction, someone teaching you how to do something step by step until you can do it correctly without supervision. And where did that instruction originate? According to Sumerian texts, from the gods themselves. The myth of Enki and the organization of the world describes how Enki travelled throughout Sumer, establishing the me for each location. He went to Nippur and established the me of kingship, to Ur and established the me of the moon god's temple, to Eridu and established the me of the sweet water and wisdom. At each place he appointed deities to oversee functions and by implication taught humans how to maintain those functions through ritual and administration. Other texts describe how the seven sages, the Apkallu, came from the Abzu before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, divination, magic. These weren't human teachers. They were sent by Enki and they transmitted knowledge that humans didn't possess. After the flood, according to the tradition, the Apkallu no longer came, but their knowledge survived, preserved in the temples, transmitted through the priesthood, encoded in rituals that were performed exactly as they had been originally demonstrated. This creates a picture of the temple system as something like a distributed network. Each temple was a node, housing specific me, staffed by specialists trained to implement those me through ritual procedures. The temples were connected, priests travelled between cities, texts were copied and shared, festivals brought populations together, but each temple had unique functions based on its deity's domain. Nippur was central because Enlil was supreme among the gods. His Ikur housed the me of ultimate authority. When a new king needed legitimacy, he went to Nippur. When major decisions affecting multiple cities needed divine sanction, they were made at Nippur. The city had no significant military power, it was never a major political capital, but it had religious authority that even the most powerful kings acknowledged. You could conquer cities, but you couldn't rule Sumer without Nippur's blessing. Eridu was the knowledge centre, because Enki was lord of wisdom and magic. The Iabzu housed libraries, scribal schools, archives of incantation texts. Priests came to Eridu to learn advanced techniques, how to read complex omens, how to counter specific curses, how to perform the most difficult healing rituals. Uruk was the gateway to the divine feminine and to kingship, because Inanna held both the me of love and war. The Iana hosted the sacred marriage ceremony, the ritual through which kings were symbolically wed to the goddess and granted the me of legitimate rule. Was the economic powerhouse, managing vast agricultural estates and trade networks because Nana regulated time itself, the lunar calendar by which planting and harvest were calculated, by which festivals were scheduled, by which business contracts were dated. The temple system was, in effect, a distributed operating system for civilization. No single temple controlled everything, but together they managed the implementation of the me across Sumer. And the system was designed, according to the texts, by the Anunnaki to function without requiring their constant presence. But the temples weren't just religious institutions, they were also economic and political centres, because the Sumerians didn't separate those functions. The temple owned land, employed workers, manufactured goods, engaged in trade, collected taxes, stored grain, lent money. The temple staff included not just priests, but scribes, accountants, surveyors, storehouse managers, merchants, craftsmen. Economic records from temple archives are among our richest sources for understanding Sumerian daily life. This economic role wasn't secondary to the religious function, it was integral. The gods, according to Sumerian belief, owned everything. The land was theirs, the crops were theirs, the labour was theirs, humans were tenants, stewards, managers of divine property. The temple administered that property. The offerings humans made weren't gifts to appease the gods, they were returning a portion of what belonged to the gods in the first place. But the gods, being distant, couldn't manage the property directly, so they appointed representatives, the king to rule, the priest to perform rituals, the administrators to manage resources. These representatives wielded authority not because they were powerful humans, but because they held divinely granted me that enabled them to function in these roles. This system had a remarkable feature. It was self-legitimizing. The king couldn't simply declare himself king. He needed Enlil's blessing, confirmed by the high priest at Nippur. The high priest couldn't simply appoint himself. He had to be chosen according to established procedure, often from the royal family, and installed in office through specific rituals. The rituals couldn't be changed at will. They followed ancient patterns preserved in written texts and oral tradition. The texts couldn't be altered casually. They were copied by trained scribes who understood that accuracy was sacred, that mistakes in ritual texts could have cosmic consequences. Each element of the system constrained every other element, creating stability. But that stability depended on something crucial, the belief that the system had been established by divine authority and would fail if humans deviated from the established procedures. Was this belief justified, or was it an elaborate control mechanism, a way for priests and kings to consolidate power by claiming divine authority? The Sumerian texts suggest neither interpretation is quite right. They describe the system not as control, but as necessary mediation. The gods were real but distant. The me were real but required implementation. The temples were functional interfaces, not theatres of deception. The priests were trained technicians, not charlatans. And the system's purpose wasn't to keep humans subservient, but to enable civilization to function without constant divine micromanagement. But if that was true, if religion was infrastructure rather than ideology, then kingship takes on a very different character. The king wasn't a dictator claiming divine right. He was an administrator operating under divine authority, constrained by that authority, responsible to it. Which brings us to kingship as sacred technology, and to the question of what happens when the human appointed to wield the me of kingship begins to understand that he's operating something much older and more powerful than his own ambition. #kingship as sacred technology. In the Louvre Museum sits a black diorite stele, nearly 8 feet tall, carved with one of the most important legal documents in human history. At the top, in bas relief, the Babylonian king Hammurabi stands before the seated god Shamash, receiving from the deity a rod and ring, the symbols of justice and kingship. Below this image, inscribed in 49 columns of cuneiform text, are 282 laws governing everything from property rights to medical malpractice, from slavery to marriage, from theft to assault. This is the famous law code of Hammurabi, dated to around 1750 BC. But what makes this tale remarkable isn't just the laws, though they're sophisticated and detailed. What's remarkable is the image at the top and what it signifies. The king doesn't claim to have invented these laws. He states explicitly that he received them from the god. His authority to legislate derives not from personal wisdom or military power, but from divine grant. He is implementing justice on behalf of the god, according to principles the god established. This wasn't unique to Hammurabi. This was the fundamental operating principle of Mesopotamian kingship for over 2,000 years. Consider what the Sumerian king lists actually document. They don't describe strong men seizing power through force. They describe kingship as a transferable authority that descends from heaven, moves from city to city, and can only be held by those to whom it's granted. The phrase appears again and again. Kingship descended from heaven at the beginning of history. Kingship passed to X when dynasties change. The verb isn't he took kingship or he claimed kingship, but he received kingship. It's passive, something done to him, not by him. When the Sumerian king Shulgi of Ur, who ruled around 2100 BC, described his accession in hymnic inscriptions, he didn't boast about his conquest or his strength. He described how An and Enlil looked favourably upon him, how they called his name for kingship, how they placed the crown on his head. These aren't metaphors for political processes. They describe a cosmic procedure. The gods choose. The king receives. His authority is legitimate because it comes from the authorized source. This had practical implications. A king's first act after taking power wasn't to subdue rivals or reward supporters. It was to travel to Nippur, to Enlil's Iker temple, and to have his kingship confirmed by the high priest. Without that confirmation, his rule remained questionable. Other cities might not acknowledge him. His own subjects might rebel. The confirmation at Nippur wasn't just ceremonial validation. It was understood as the actual moment when kingship was transferred from heaven to the chosen individual. What did this confirmation ceremony involve? The texts are fragmentary, but we have enough detail to reconstruct the outline. The king designate entered the Iker compound. He underwent purification, ritual washing, donning sacred garments. He was brought before the cult statue of Enlil in the inner sanctuary, a space so holy that only the highest priests and the king himself could enter. There, the high priest pronounced the oracle, "Enlil has chosen you." Enlil grants you the me of kingship. Enlil places his hand upon you for the shepherding of the black-headed people. The king then received physical symbols of authority, the crown, the scepter, sometimes a throne or a ceremonial weapon. These weren't just symbols. They were understood as vessels for the me of kingship, objects charged with the divine authority that would enable the king to function as king. Without these objects, without the me they contained, he was just a man with an army. Once confirmed, the king returned to his own city and performed installation rituals there. He ascended the throne in his palace. He made offerings at his city's main temple. He issued his first proclamations, often including declarations of debt forgiveness or tax relief, demonstrating that his authority was benevolent, ordained to care for the people, not to exploit them. But the kingship he now wielded came with constraints. He wasn't a god, and the texts are careful to maintain that distinction. When Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, is described in epic poetry, the text says explicitly 2/3 of him is God, 1/3 is human. This acknowledges his semi-divine status while maintaining the boundary. He is extraordinary, beloved of the gods, but still mortal, still subject to death. The living kings made no claim even to partial divinity, with one exception. During the Ua III period, 2112-2004 BC Sman, kings began adding the divine determinative to their names, the cuneiform sign, that indicated divinity. This was a departure, and it didn't last. By the old Babylonian period, the practice had ceased. Kings returned to human status, however exalted. Why did the Year 3 experiment with divine kingship end? The texts don't say explicitly, but we can infer. The system had a built-in check. Kingship was granted by the gods and could be withdrawn. When a dynasty fell, when a city was conquered, when a king was defeated, the Mesopotamian interpretation was consistent. The gods had withdrawn their favour. Kingship had been transferred to another. The defeated king hadn't simply lost militarily, he'd lost his divine mandate. This created a pragmatic theology. Success proved divine favour. Failure proved divine withdrawal. But crucially, this didn't make kingship arbitrary. The gods didn't grant kingship randomly. They chose based on fitness, though what constituted fitness was understood through a religious lens. A king who maintained temples, performed rituals correctly, judged justly, led armies effectively, ensured prosperity, managed irrigation, stored grain against famine, such a king demonstrated that he properly wielded the me of kingship. The gods continued to favour him. A king who neglected temples, allowed rituals to lapse, judged unjustly, led armies to defeat, brought drought or plague, failed to manage resources, such a king was demonstrating that he'd lost the me of kingship, or had never truly received it. His fall was inevitable. This framework made kingship a sacred technology, a granted capacity to fulfill specific functions. And those functions were clearly defined across hundreds of royal inscriptions. First, the king was shepherd of the people. This wasn't just pastoral imagery, it was functional description. Like a shepherd with a flock, the king was responsible for the welfare of the population entrusted to him. He ensured they were fed, protected, guided, and that any who wandered were brought back. He didn't own the flock, the gods did. He managed it on their behalf. Second, the king was builder of temples. Nearly every royal inscription begins with or emphasizes temple construction and renovation. Kings competed to build the largest, most magnificent, most enduring temples. Why? Because the temple was the god's dwelling, and maintaining that dwelling was the king's primary responsibility. A king who allowed temples to fall into disrepair was failing the god and would lose divine favour. Third, the king was one who restores the cosmic order. The Sumerian term is Megar, literally establisher of the me. When chaos threatened, through war, natural disaster, social upheaval, economic crisis, the king's role was to restore the proper functioning of the me. This might involve military action, rebuilding infrastructure, legal reform, economic redistribution, or ritual propitiation of the gods. Fourth, the king was one who digs canals. In the arid Mesopotamian climate, irrigation was life. The canal systems required constant maintenance, periodic expansion, coordinated labour. Managing water was managing survival. Kings who successfully extended irrigation, opened new land to cultivation, or restored abandoned fields were celebrated as fulfilling divine mandate. Fifth, the king was righteous judge. He heard legal appeals, issued rulings, promulgated laws. But his justice wasn't arbitrary. It was supposed to reflect divine justice, implementing on earth the same principles of right order that structured the cosmos. Hammurabi's law code explicitly frames itself this way. These laws enable the strong to not oppress the weak and allow the orphan and widow to find justice. Sixth, the king was protector of the land. He led armies, built walls, made alliances, defeated enemies. But warfare in Mesopotamian ideology wasn't just political, it was cosmic. The enemy was always, at least rhetorically, an enemy of the gods. Victory was divine favour made manifest. Defeat was divine judgment. These weren't abstract roles, they were practical functions, and success in them was measurable. Was the population fed? Were the temples maintained? Were the canals flowing? Were disputes being resolved? Were the borders secure? And here's the remarkable thing. This system worked for centuries without a central imperial authority enforcing it. The individual Sumerian city-states fought wars with each other constantly. Kingship moved from city to city as power shifted, but every king, regardless of which city he ruled, operated within the same framework. Every king claimed legitimacy through Enlil at Nippur. Every king framed his rule as shepherding the black-headed people. Every king built temples and dug canals and issued laws. The specific form of government varied. Some cities had strong centralized kingship. Others had more collective governance through assemblies. But the ideological framework remained constant. Why this consistency? Because the Sumerians believed the framework was divinely established. Kingship wasn't a human institution that evolved through political experimentation. It was a granted authority with specific functions, and to deviate from those functions was to lose the authority. This made Mesopotamian kingship fundamentally different from, say, Egyptian pharaonic kingship. The pharaoh was understood as a living god, the incarnation of Horus, son of Ra. His authority was intrinsic to his divine nature. Mesopotamian kings never claimed this. Their authority was granted, external, conditional. They were representatives, administrators, stewards. They wielded the me of kingship, but they didn't embody divinity. This also made Mesopotamian kingship different from later European concepts of divine right. European monarchs claimed God had appointed them, and therefore rebellion against the king was rebellion against God. But Mesopotamian theology built in the possibility of divine withdrawal. If the king failed, the gods could transfer kingship to another. Rebellion might actually be the mechanism through which the gods enacted their judgment. This created a strange paradox, a system that claimed absolute divine authority for kingship while simultaneously making that authority contingent on performance. The king was all-powerful because the gods granted him authority, but he could lose that authority if he failed to fulfill his functions. The system was totalizing and precarious at the same time, and at the centre of it all was the me of kingship, the divine capacity to rule granted from heaven, implemented through specific roles and responsibilities, constrained by the very authority that empowered it. But the king, for all his authority, was still just one element in a larger system. He couldn't function alone. He needed the priesthood to maintain the rituals that kept the gods favourably disposed. He needed the administrators to manage the economy. He needed the scribes to document his decrees and preserve the legal traditions. He needed the craftsmen to build his palaces and temples. He needed the farmers to produce the surplus that sustained civilization. And all of these roles, all of these functions, were understood in the same way the kingship was understood, as implementations of specific me, granted by the gods, maintained through correct procedure. The priesthood, in particular, held a unique position. They weren't subordinate to the king in the way a modern religious establishment might be subordinate to secular authority. They held their own me, their own direct grant of authority from the gods. The king might be the most powerful human in the city, but in the temple, in the presence of the god, the high priest's authority was supreme. This created a system of checks and balances, though not in the modern political sense. The king and the priesthood constrained each other. The king couldn't claim unlimited authority because the priests controlled access to divine legitimacy. The priests couldn't claim unlimited authority because they depended on the king to provide resources, protection, and enforcement of their decrees. But more than that, both king and priest were constrained by procedure. The rituals had to be performed correctly. The laws had to reflect divine justice. The me had to be implemented according to the patterns that had been established. And those patterns, according to every text that addresses the question, came from the Anunnaki. This is where the system reveals its deepest logic. Religion wasn't created to give kings power over people. Religion was created to constrain kings and priests, holding them accountable to procedures and principles they didn't invent and couldn't change. The authority was divine, but because it was divine, it was also limited. You couldn't just make up new rules and claim divine sanction. The rules already existed, established by the gods, preserved in texts and traditions, and enforced by the system itself. If a king or priest violated the procedures, the system had a built-in correction mechanism. Failure. The crops would fail. The armies would lose. The people would suffer. And when that happened, the interpretation was always the same. The gods have withdrawn their favour because the me are not being implemented correctly. This might sound like unfalsifiable theology. Any outcome can be explained by saying the gods were pleased or displeased. But in practice, it created a surprisingly stable framework. Kings and priests had strong incentives to maintain the system. Success depended on correct implementation. And correct implementation meant following the established procedures, preserving the ancient knowledge, maintaining the infrastructure. Religion, in this light, was the operating manual for a civilization that believed it had been designed and established by beings more advanced than themselves. The manual specified roles, procedures, architectures, technologies. Humanity's job was to run the system according to specifications, not to redesign it according to their own ideas. But what were those specifications? How detailed were the procedures? And who were the specialists trained to implement them? The answer takes us into the technical heart of the system, the priesthood's procedural knowledge, and the extraordinary precision with which that knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The priesthood's procedural knowledge. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds thousands of tablets from Nippur's temple quarter, many still being translated. Among them are ritual instruction manuals so detailed they read like laboratory protocols. One text, catalogued among the liturgical collections, describes the daily care of Enlil's statue. The procedure begins before dawn. The priest enters through the side gate, never the main entrance outside ritual hours, after washing in the temple's sacred pool. He wears linen, not wool, because wool comes from dead animals and carries impurity. He has fasted since sunset, his head is shaved, his hands have been washed 3 times. The inner sanctuary is dark. He lights a specific type of lamp, filled with sesame oil, wick trimmed to precise length. The flame must not smoke. He approaches the statue singing a specific hymn. The text provides the words in Sumerian and the musical notation in cuneiform. He opens the curtain that has covered the statue through the night. He speaks the words of awakening, Lord Enlil, the night has passed, the day has come, open your holy eyes upon your land. The ritual continues for 2 hours. The statue is bathed with water from a specific well. It's dried with linen cloths. It's dressed in garments woven by temple priestesses who themselves underwent purification during the weaving. It's anointed with 7 different oils, each applied to a different part of the statue in a specific order. Food is presented, bread of a specific grain, dates of a specific variety, beer brewed according to sacred recipe. The food sits before the statue for a measured time while incense burns. Then it's removed to be distributed among the temple staff. Every step matters. Every detail is specified. Why? Because this wasn't worship in the sense of expressing devotion. This was maintenance. The statue was the god's physical presence on earth, and that presence required daily care to remain active and benevolent. The priest wasn't praising Enlil, he was enabling Enlil to function through the statue, to be present in the temple, to be accessible to the city. This distinction is crucial. The Sumerian priesthood wasn't primarily concerned with theology, with explaining who the gods were or why they acted as they did. They were concerned with procedure, with doing the correct actions in the correct order at the correct times. They were technicians implementing a system, not philosophers contemplating mysteries. Consider the Ib priests. specialists in purification. They possessed texts, many survive, documenting which incantations removed which impurities. The texts specify, for impurity from death, use this water source, this specific herb, these words in this order. For impurity from disease, use that water source, that specific mineral, those words in that rhythm. For impurity from broken taboo, use this combination, this gesture, this timing relative to the moon's phase. This is diagnostic procedure. The priest identifies the type of impurity, selects the appropriate protocol, implements it precisely. The incantations weren't prayers asking gods to remove impurity. They were formulae that, when spoken correctly in the correct context, removed impurity. The difference is metaphysically significant. Or consider the bar priests, the diviners. They examined sheep livers to determine the will of the gods before major decisions, going to war, building temples, appointing officials, signing treaties. But they didn't just look at livers and interpret randomly. They had comprehensive manuals, omen compendiums, cataloguing thousands of liver configurations and their meanings. If the liver's left lobe has this marking, and the gallbladder shows that discoloration, and the windpipe shows this deviation, then the omen indicates success in military endeavours, but caution in economic ventures. These omen texts were copied, studied, memorised by apprentice diviners who spent years learning the system. The liver was understood as a microcosm, reflecting cosmic patterns, but reading it required training, not inspiration. It was a skill, like reading astronomical tables or surveying land. The astronomical knowledge preserved by temple scribes demonstrates this technical orientation most clearly. The Mulpin tablets, star catalogues compiled in the late 2nd millennium BC, but preserving much older observations, list constellations, their rising and setting times, their relationships to the calendar. The scribes who maintained these tablets weren't making poetic observations about the beauty of the night sky. They were tracking celestial movements, because those movements determined when rituals should be performed, when festivals should begin, when agricultural activities should commence. They knew Venus's 8-year cycle with remarkable precision. They could predict lunar eclipses. They understood the mathematics of the sexagesimal system, base 60, which they used for astronomical calculations. This wasn't primitive superstition, this was sophisticated observational astronomy in service of ritual precision. And all of this knowledge was understood as transmitted, not discovered. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, had come before the flood and taught humanity these arts. The temple schools preserved what the Apkallu taught. When a scribe copied an astronomical text, he was preserving knowledge that came from the gods through their agents. When a priest performed a ritual, he was implementing a procedure the gods had originally demonstrated. When a diviner read omens, he was accessing a system of signs the gods had established. The education of a priest took decades. A boy, usually from a priestly family, though occasionally selected for aptitude, entered the temple school around age 7. He learned to read and write cuneiform, starting with simple signs, progressing to complex texts. He copied literary works, myths, hymns, proverbs, not for their content primarily, but to master the script and the language. Sumerian was already a dead language by 2000 BC, preserved only in religious contexts. So he was learning what was effectively a foreign language used exclusively for ritual. He memorized hymns. He learned to sing them with correct intonation. He practiced ritual gestures until they became automatic. He studied the properties of substances, oils, incenses, minerals, herbs used in rituals. He learned to identify astronomical phenomena. He studied the Omean texts. He learned the proper procedures for approaching the divine presence, for offering sacrifices, for maintaining purity. By his 20s, if he succeeded, he was initiated into one of the priestly orders. The initiation itself was a ritual, a procedure that conferred upon him the me of priesthood. After initiation, he could perform rituals whose effects were understood as real. Before initiation, even if he performed the same actions, they wouldn't work. The me made the difference. This suggests that the Sumerian understanding of ritual was closer to our understanding of technology than our understanding of symbolism. A ritual was a procedure that, correctly performed by authorized personnel, produced specific results. Like any technology, it required training to use, and improper use produced failure or even danger. The temple archives preserved the procedures. Thousands of tablets documented rituals for every occasion: daily temple service, monthly festivals, annual celebrations, coronations, building dedications, warfare preparations, drought responses, plague countermeasures. Each ritual specified timing, materials, participants, words, gestures. Nothing was left to chance or personal interpretation. This raises a question. If religion was procedural knowledge implemented by trained specialists, where did the procedures come from? The Sumerian answer was consistent: from the gods, through intermediaries, before or shortly after the flood. But that answer requires us to take seriously the possibility that the knowledge wasn't developed, but transmitted, that someone taught humanity these procedures, trained the first priests, established the first temples, demonstrated the first rituals. The alternative interpretation, that priests invented elaborate procedures and claimed divine origin to secure their authority, struggles to explain certain features of the system. Why create procedures so complex they required decades of training? Why encode astronomical knowledge that took centuries of observation to accumulate? Why preserve a dead language exclusively for ritual use? Why maintain such precise architectural templates across generations? If the goal was simply social control, simpler systems would suffice. The elaborate complexity of Mesopotamian ritual suggests something else: the preservation of a system whose origins lay beyond the reach of any individual priesthood's innovation, maintained because deviation was understood as dangerous, not because it threatened priestly authority, but because it threatened the system's function. That function, according to the texts, was maintaining contact, keeping open the channels through which divine authority operated on earth, through which the me could flow from heaven to the human realm. The priest operated the interface, and like any operator of complex systems, he followed protocols developed by those who designed the system. But priests weren't the only ones wielding objects of power. Certain artifacts, according to Sumerian texts, embodied authority so fundamental that whoever possessed them ruled not just humans but gods. The Tablet of Destinies, authority made physical. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets discovered across multiple sites, describes an object that modern readers often dismiss as mythological symbolism, the Tablet of Destinies. In the story, this tablet is first possessed by Tiamat, the primordial ocean goddess. When Marduk defeats her and creates the ordered cosmos from her chaos, the other gods grant him the tablet as symbol of supreme authority. But the text doesn't describe it as merely symbolic, it describes it as operational. Whoever holds the Tablet of Destinies decrees the fates of gods and men, and those decrees cannot be altered. This isn't unique to the Enuma Elish. The Tablet of Destinies appears across Mesopotamian literature, and its function remains consistent. It's the source code of reality. Possession grants authority. Control enables command over cosmic order. Loss means catastrophe. The Anzu myth, one of the oldest surviving Mesopotamian narratives, centers entirely on the theft of the Tablet of Destinies. The story describes how Anzu, a lion-headed eagle, steals the tablet from Enlil while the god bathes. With the tablet, Anzu can decree his own supremacy. The gods panic. Without the tablet, cosmic order breaks down. Several gods attempt to retrieve it, but fail. Finally, Ninurta, the warrior god, succeeds through a combination of strength and strategy. He kills Anzu, retrieves the tablet, returns it to Enlil. Order is restored. The narrative structure is instructive. The tablet isn't just a symbol of authority that only matters because people believe it matters. Its theft causes actual breakdown. The gods lose the ability to decree fates. Their commands don't work. The system stops functioning. Only when the tablet is physically recovered does authority return. This suggests the Sumerians conceived of authority as embodied in objects, not as abstract social agreement. The crown, the scepter, the throne, the tablet of destinies, these weren't representing power. They were enabling power. They were, in effect, hardware through which software ran. Consider what this implies about the me. If the me were divine powers that could be transferred, stolen, possessed, then they might have physical instantiations. The crown that a king received at Nippur wasn't just a ceremonial object. It was charged with the me of kingship. Wearing it, the king could function as king. Without it, his authority was questionable. The priestly garments weren't just uniforms. They marked the wearer as possessing the me of priesthood, authorized to perform procedures that wouldn't work if performed by someone uninitialized. This sounds like magical thinking to modern ears, but the Sumerians weren't describing magic, at least not in the sense of supernatural intervention breaking natural laws. They were describing a system where certain objects enabled certain functions, where authorization mattered, where procedures required proper equipment. Modern parallels exist. A doctor's authority to prescribe medication isn't inherent in her person. It derives from credentials, physical documents certifying training and licensure. Without those documents, the same medical knowledge can't be legally implemented. The credentials enable function. The Sumerian crown and priestly robes work similarly, though the authorization came from divine sources rather than human institutions. The Tablet of Destinies represents the extreme case, an object that embodied cosmic authority itself, and significantly, it had to be protected. When stolen, catastrophe followed. When recovered, order returned. The object mattered physically, not just symbolic. Other objects in Sumerian texts have similar properties. The me that Inanna steals from Enki are loaded physically onto her boat. They have presence, weight, location. Enki's boat itself, the ibex of the Abzu, is described as technological, able to navigate both surface water and subterranean channels. Dumuzi's crown gives him authority over flocks and fields. The divine weapons, Ninurta's mace, Inanna's ring and lash, aren't just metaphors for power. They enable specific actions that can't be performed without them. This pattern suggests that the Anunnaki, as described in the texts, didn't rule through abstract authority or spiritual power. They wielded tools, objects that enabled functions. And some of those objects, or replicas of them, were granted to humans, allowing human representatives to implement divine authority on earth. The king held a scepter that embodied royal power. The priest wore garments that enabled ritual function. The diviner possessed tablets that allowed reading cosmic signs. The scribe wielded stylus and clay that transformed thought into permanent record. Each tool was sacred because each enabled something humans otherwise couldn't do. This technological interpretation of religious objects isn't typically how scholars read these texts, but it's how the texts consistently describe them as functional, not symbolic, as enabling, not representing. And if the objects mattered, if authorization required physical instantiation, then the system the Anunnaki established wasn't just ideological, it was material infrastructure. Tools distributed according to function, objects empowering specific roles, hardware implementing divine software. But for all this systematization, for all this carefully established order, something changed after the flood. The texts document it clearly. Direct divine management decreased. The system continued, but the gods withdrew to a distance. The question is why, and what that withdrawal reveals about religion's purpose. When gods withdrew, the flood is restructuring. CBS 10673, that fragment discovered at Nippur, describes the aftermath of the flood with striking procedural language. After the waters recede, after Ziusudra emerges and makes sacrifice, the gods Anan Enlil decree, life like a god we grant him, eternal life like a god we place before his nostrils. But this isn't standard immortality, it's specific. Ziusudra is taken to Dilmun, the paradise at the edge of the world. He's placed there, positioned, given a role to live as bridge, as reminder, as the last human who knew the gods before the flood. Then the text lists cities, deities assigned to each, a framework being established. This isn't recovery, it's reorganization. The world before the flood operated one way, the world after operates differently. What changed? The Atrahasis epic provides context. Before the flood, gods and humans coexisted closely. The young gods laboured until rebellion. Humanity was created to replace that labour, but humanity multiplied beyond control. The noise, their chaos, their complexity, disturbed divine rest. Enlil sought the ultimate solution, complete removal, the flood. But Enki's intervention saved a remnant. The question then became, how do we prevent the same problem recurring? The solution, distance. Population controls, shorter fertility, increased infant mortality, barrenness for some women, and structural distance, less direct divine presence, more mediated interaction. The king lists encode this shift. Pre-flood rulers reigned for astronomical lengths, 28,800 years, 43,200 years. Post-flood rulers reigned for centuries, then merely decades. The numbers might be symbolic, might use different timescales, but the pattern is consistent, separation increasing, divine life extending less fully into human experience. The instructions given to post-flood rulers emphasize maintenance rather than direct guidance. Build temples, create dwelling places where gods can be present without requiring their continuous physical manifestation. Institute priesthood, train specialists who can maintain contact without requiring gods to interact with the general population. Perform rituals, repeatable procedures that sustain cosmic order without requiring divine intervention each time. Religion emerges from this restructuring not as control mechanism, but as distance management system. When you can't be present directly, you create interfaces. When you can't manage daily operations, you train administrators. When you can't intervene constantly, you establish procedures that maintain order through human implementation. The Eridu Genesis, an earlier Sumerian version of the flood story discovered in fragments at Eridu itself, makes this explicit. Before the flood, kingship existed, but was differently structured. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven in a new form. Temple building became central. The relationship between divine and human formalized through architecture, through priesthood, through ritual calendar. Lamentations texts, written when cities fell to warfare or disaster, consistently frame catastrophe as divine absence. The god has abandoned his dwelling. The goddess has turned her face away. The temple stands empty. The rituals continue, but produce no response. This isn't poetry. It's documentation of system failure. The interface no longer functions because the divine presence has withdrawn completely. But why would withdrawal require such elaborate infrastructure? Why not simply depart and let humanity develop independently? The texts suggest a middle path. The Anunnaki withdrew from daily management but maintained ultimate authority. The system they established, religion, allowed that maintenance without requiring their constant presence. The king administered in their name. The priest contacted them through ritual. The temple housed their presence at one remove. The me continued to operate through human implementation. This explains religion's paradoxical character, powerful yet not omnipresent, authoritative yet distant, demanding yet seemingly absent. The system was designed for a situation where the designers had withdrawn, but their design continued operating. The flood served as reset button. The warning and survival of one human, Ziusudra Atrahasis, the figure who appears under different names across texts, preserved continuity. He remembered the before. He transmitted to the after. And what he transmitted wasn't just stories, but instructions, how to rebuild, how to maintain, how to operate the system the gods had established. This pattern of catastrophe survival transmission appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian texts, suggesting it was understood as the mechanism through which critical knowledge passed across civilizational collapse. When the system breaks down, one who remembers preserves it. When humanity rebuilds, the preserved knowledge ensures continuity, which raises the question, what knowledge exactly was being preserved? What did the survivors of catastrophe carry forward that justified such emphasis on transmission? The instructions, preserving what came before. The instructions of Shuruppak, preserved on tablets from the early 2nd millennium BC, but claiming to document wisdom from before the flood, opens with a formula: in those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those far away nights, in those years, in those far remote years. The language emphasizes distance, antiquity, the pastness of what follows. Then, in those days, the wise one, who knew how to speak with elaborate words, and lived in Sumer, Shuruppak gave instructions to his son. Shuruppak is one of the 5 antediluvian cities listed in the Weld Blundell Prism. The Shuruppak giving instructions is described as both king of that city and father of Zisudra, the flood survivor. The instructions are pre-flood wisdom, transmitted to the one human who would carry them into the post-flood world. What does the text preserve? Practical advice. Don't steal, don't murder, don't fornicate with slave girls, don't break down boundaries between fields, don't testify falsely, honour your mother, fear your God, respect your king. This reads like standard wisdom literature, the accumulated ethical common sense of any functioning society. But interspersed are stranger injunctions. Do not speak too quickly, it may trap you later. Do not choose a wife during a festival, her character is unknown then. A loving heart maintains a family, a hateful heart destroys a family. These aren't just moral rules, they're observations about how systems work. Family systems, social systems, linguistic systems. They demonstrate understanding that actions have consequences, that order requires maintenance, that deviation produces breakdown. The text concludes, "Pay attention to my words, do not transgress them. The instructions which I have given you should not be neglected." The emphasis on preservation, on non-alteration, matches what we see throughout Mesopotamian texts treating ancient wisdom. Don't innovate, don't improve, preserve and implement. Why this conservatism? If humanity developed ethics through experience, shouldn't each generation refine what came before? The Mesopotamian answer, because this knowledge wasn't developed through trial and error. It was taught by Shuruppak, who learnt it from the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came from the Abzu, bearing wisdom from Enki. The Sumerian king list notes that one early ruler, Enmedaranki of Sippar, was taken by the gods and taught divination, then sent back to teach humans. He became the founder of the Bur priest lineage. His knowledge, reading omens, interpreting signs, came directly from divine instruction. His descendants preserved that knowledge through initiation and training. Similar transmission accounts appear for other specialized knowledge. The craft of metalworking was taught by Enki, the art of music by Ninata, the science of building by Ea. Humanity didn't discover these arts through gradual experimentation. They received them, then refined the implementation while preserving core principles. This creates a different model of knowledge than modern epistemology assumes. We think knowledge accumulates, each generation adding to what came before, correcting errors, expanding understanding. The Mesopotamian model describes knowledge as granted, then degraded through transmission losses unless carefully preserved. The emphasis on copying texts exactly, on memorizing rituals precisely, on maintaining architectural templates perfectly makes sense in this model. You're not dealing with human constructions that can be improved. You're maintaining received systems that degrade if not preserved carefully. The instructions of Shuruppak represent the simplest form of this preservation, ethical wisdom passed father to son, pre-flood to post-flood. But other texts preserve more complex knowledge, astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, mathematical tables demonstrating sophisticated calculation, medical diagnostic procedures, legal precedents, agricultural techniques optimized for specific soils and climates, and underlying all of it, the framework of religion itself, how to build temples, how to perform rituals, how to contact the divine, how to implement the me, how to maintain cosmic order through human action. If this knowledge came from the Anunnaki, transmitted before or shortly after the flood, then religion was the meta-system preserving all other preserved knowledge. The temple wasn't just where you contacted gods, it was where you stored the accumulated wisdom necessary for civilization to function. The priesthood wasn't just ritual specialists, they were archivists, teachers, preservers of knowledge across generations. When cities fell, when dynasties collapsed, when invasions destroyed infrastructure, the temples survived or were rebuilt first. Not because religion was most important emotionally, but because it was most important functionally, the repository of knowledge required for recovery. But the system wasn't perfect. Catastrophes did occur. Cities were destroyed. Knowledge was lost. And when the system failed, when the promises embedded in the religious framework didn't deliver, humans questioned. Those questions survive in texts that challenge the very order the system claimed to preserve. When the system fails, Lamentations and Theodicy. The Lament for Ur, composed after the city's destruction by Elamite invasion around 2000 BCE, is one of the most haunting documents from the ancient world. Over 400 lines describe the city's fall, temples burning, people slaughtered, the gods themselves weeping as they abandon their shrines. But the lament isn't just mourning, it's theological crisis. The text explicitly states that Enlil decreed Ur's destruction, the same God who granted Ur prosperity, who established its kingship, who blessed its temples, decreed its ending. Why? The text provides no clear answer. Ur hadn't abandoned the gods. Its temples were maintained, its rituals performed, its kings were pious. Yet Enlil's assembly decided to destroy the city, to overthrow its people. That is the decree. The goddess Ningal, patron of Ur, pleads with the assembly to reverse the decree. They refuse. She must watch her city die. This isn't the religion of divine reward for piety and punishment for sin. This is arbitrary devastation imposed by the very beings who supposedly protected the city. The theological problem is stark. If the system works, if maintaining temples, performing rituals, serving the gods produces divine favour, then why does Ur fall despite perfect compliance? The Babylonian Theodicy, a philosophical dialogue preserved on tablets from around 1000 BC, addresses this problem directly. A sufferer complains to his friend, "I have honoured the gods, performed the rituals, made the offerings, yet I suffer while the impious prosper. Where is divine justice?" The friend offers conventional responses. You cannot know divine will. The gods' ways are mysterious. Continue piety. Eventually, justice prevails. But the sufferer refuses comfort. I see the wicked succeed, while the righteous suffer. The gods establish justice, yet justice isn't manifest. Either the gods are unjust, or the system doesn't work as claimed. The friend, increasingly uncomfortable, maintains orthodoxy. The gods gave humanity wickedness along with righteousness. This is their plan. But the sufferer's questions remain unanswered. These texts are remarkable for their preservation. They question divine justice, challenge the system's promises, document its failures. Yet scribes copied them, archived them in temples, transmitted them alongside orthodox hymns and ritual texts. Why preserve doubt? Perhaps because the system was honest about its limitations. It promised that correct implementation of the me produced order, but it acknowledged that the gods could override that order. Kingship descended from heaven, but could be withdrawn. Divine favour blessed cities, but could be removed. The rituals worked, except when the gods decided otherwise. This creates a troubling theology. The system isn't mechanical. You can't guarantee results through correct procedure. Divine will supersede procedure. But then, why maintain the procedures so carefully? If the gods can arbitrarily decide to destroy a perfectly pious city, what's the point of piety? The Mesopotamian answer seems to be pragmatic. The system usually works. Temples maintained properly usually prosper. Kings who serve the gods usually succeed. Cities that perform rituals usually avoid catastrophe. The system provides order, stability, prosperity most of the time. But it's not a contract guaranteeing outcomes. It's a framework that works unless the gods decide to alter course. This acknowledgement of divine unpredictability is surprisingly modern. It admits that the universe doesn't operate according to simple moral calculus. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. You can do everything correctly and still fail. The system provides structure, not certainty. But if this was understood, why did people maintain the system? If you can't guarantee divine favour through correct ritual, why perform the rituals? Several answers emerge from the texts. First, even though the system doesn't guarantee success, it increases its probability. Cities with maintained temples usually fared better than cities with neglected temples. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to justify the effort. Second, the system provided meaning. Even when catastrophe struck, it could be interpreted within the framework. Fell because Enlil decreed it, not because chaos was meaningless. The gods had reasons, even if humans couldn't discern them. The theological framework preserved human dignity by maintaining that events had purpose, even terrible events. Third, the system was all they had. If you reject the divine order, what replaces it? Individual human will? Social contract? These concepts didn't exist in Mesopotamian thought. The alternative to divine order wasn't freedom, it was chaos. Better to maintain the system, acknowledge its limitations, and work within it, than to abandon it for nothing. But the questions persisted. Why do the gods act as they do? What governs their decisions? Is there structure above the gods themselves? Cosmic law they must follow? The answer lies in texts that attempted to map divine hierarchy, to document who held authority over whom, who could decree what, who answered to whom in the celestial administration. The hierarchy made explicit. The Anscall Ainam God list, compiled during the 2nd millennium BC, but preserving much older traditions, is unlike anything modern readers expect from religious texts. It's not poetry, not narrative, not theology, it's a catalogue. 7 tablets, listing over 2,000 divine names in strict hierarchical order. Tablet 1 begins with An, the sky god, and his consort Antu. Then their children, their servants, their associated minor deities. Each entry follows a formula, divine name, relationship to other deities, sometimes a brief note on function or location. The list continues through Enlil and his court, Enki and his household, each major god with their retinue, their children, their servants, their associated powers. This isn't worship, it's organisation chart. It documents who reports to whom, who holds authority over what domain, who can be appealed to for which needs. And the precision suggests this information mattered practically, not just theologically. Why would priests need to know that a specific minor deity was the 3rd servant of the 5th son of Enlil? Because if you're performing a ritual that invokes that deity's authority, you need to approach them through proper channels. You don't go directly to a minor administrative deity. You invoke their superior, who invokes their superior, up the chain to the level appropriate for your need. This is bureaucracy. divine bureaucracy, documented with the same precision Mesopotamian scribes applied to economic administration. The heaven was organized like the palace: departments, hierarchies, jurisdictions, proper channels of communication. The implication is profound. The gods weren't mysterious, ineffable, beyond human comprehension. They were highly organized, clearly structured, functioning according to rules that could be learned, documented, followed. This organizational understanding of divinity makes ritual precision make sense. If you're trying to contact a specific deity for a specific purpose, you need to invoke them correctly, with proper titles, through proper intermediaries, at proper times. Like sending a petition through governmental channels, protocol matters. It also makes priestly training make sense. You're not just learning theology, you're learning organizational structure. Who to contact for agricultural blessings: Ni Kimdu, son of Enki, overseer of irrigation. Who to contact for protection in battle: Nuuta, son of Enlil, warrior of the gods. Who to contact for legal judgment: sun god, illuminator of truth. Wrong deity means ineffective ritual, like submitting your legal appeal to the agricultural department. The Anacoranium also documents something else. Divine families were extensive, divine jurisdictions specific, divine functions specialized. This wasn't monotheism or even simple polytheism. This was a cosmic administrative system with thousands of specialized positions, each held by a specific entity with specific authorities. And at the top, An, Enlil, Enki, the great gods who held supreme authority. But even they answered to something: the divine assembly, where major decisions were made collectively. No god, not even Enlil, could decree alone without assembly consensus. This shows in multiple myths. Enlil proposes the flood, but the assembly must approve. Marduk defeats Tiamat, but the assembly must confirm his supremacy. The divine administration was checked and balanced, not democratic. The great gods held far more weight than minor deities, but not arbitrary either. Decisions followed procedure. Authority was distributed. Even the gods operated within a system. This organizational view suggests the Anunnaki, as described in Sumerian texts, functioned less like the omnipotent deities of later monotheism and more like advanced administrators of a complex system. They held vast power and knowledge relative to humans, but they too operated within structures, followed rules, worked within jurisdictions. Religion, from this perspective, was documentation of that administrative system and training in how to interact with it properly. The temple was the earthly branch office. The priest was the trained liaison. The ritual was the proper protocol for submitting requests or maintaining communication. This seems almost prosaic compared to typical religious interpretation, but it matches how the texts actually describe divine-human interaction: procedural, organizational, structured. Not mysterious communion, but systematic communication through established channels. Whether this means the Anunnaki were literally administrators, whether they were ancient advanced humans mythologized over time, whether they were symbolic representations of natural forces, or whether they were something else entirely, these questions the texts don't directly answer. But they do answer how the Sumerians understood their relationship to the divine, as operational, not mystical, as maintained through procedure, not through faith, as documentation, not mythology. 3 readings of this evidence remain possible, each with different implications. 3 readings of the same evidence. The tablets sit in museum vaults, in university collections, in climate-controlled rooms scattered across the world. CBS 10673 in Philadelphia, the Weld Blundell Prism in Oxford, Atrahasis fragments in the British Museum. Thousands of texts describing the same system from different angles, all claiming the same origin, knowledge from the gods, transmitted to humanity, preserved through catastrophe. How do we read this evidence? The first reading, pure mythology. These texts are symbolic narratives explaining natural phenomena, social structures, and psychological experiences through personified forces. The Anunnaki are literary devices representing aspects of human experience. Enlil is authority and storm. Inanna is desire and conflict. Enki is creativity and wisdom. The rituals are performances reinforcing social cohesion. The temples are political centres wrapped in sacred language. The priesthood is an exploitative class using divine claims to consolidate power. The me are reifications of cultural practices made concrete through narrative. The precision of ritual is how traditions perpetuate themselves. The flood is cultural memory of catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamian plains. Religion emerged as humans sought meaning and control, inventing gods to explain what they couldn't understand. This reading has scholarly consensus. It requires no extraordinary claims. It fits religion as evolved social technology models, but it struggles with certain features. Why so much technical complexity for social control? Why preserve a dead language exclusively for ritual? Why such precise astronomical knowledge in temple contexts? Why encode mathematical sophistication into ritual timing? The symbolic interpretation must argue these are evolutionary byproducts or elaborate priestcraft, but the elaboration seems disproportionate to the need. The second reading, Encoded Wisdom. These texts preserve sophisticated philosophical and practical knowledge in mythological form. The Anunnaki represent natural principles, An is sky atmosphere, Enlil is wind weather, Enki is water wisdom, but understood with proto-scientific precision. The rituals encode knowledge, astronomical observations packaged as festival timing, agricultural techniques preserved as divine instruction, medical procedures framed as incantations. The temples are universities preserving knowledge across generations. The priesthood is scientist scribes maintaining technical traditions. The me are taxonomies of civilizational knowledge. The precision reflects genuine understanding wrapped in mythological language to ensure transmission. The flood is historical memory of real catastrophe, possibly the Black Sea inundation or rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Religion emerged as the package ensuring survival knowledge persisted through catastrophic loss. This reading takes the text more seriously while avoiding supernatural claims. It explains the technical sophistication, the preservation emphasis, the procedural focus. It suggests the Sumerians were more scientifically advanced than usually credited in coding real knowledge in religious forms. But it struggles with consistency. If it's encoded knowledge, why preserve the encoding after understanding develops? Why maintain the mythological frame once you know its allegory? Why do later civilizations treat these traditions as literal history rather than decoded wisdom? The third reading, Historical Documentation. These texts are the Sumerian record of actual events involving beings they called Anunnaki, whether biological entities from elsewhere, surviving remnants of a pre-catastrophe advanced civilization, or something else that doesn't fit modern categories. The knowledge was transmitted because it came from beings more technologically advanced. The rituals preserved procedures demonstrated by those beings. The temples were built to specifications provided by them. The priesthood maintained systems they didn't invent. The me were real technologies or knowledge sets transferred to humanity. The precision reflects original instruction quality. The flood was a real catastrophe, possibly globally or regionally devastating, that nearly ended human civilization. Religion emerged as the framework the Anunnaki established for managing humanity at a distance after withdrawing from direct management post-catastrophe. This reading takes the texts at face value from the Sumerian perspective. It requires extraordinary claims about the Anunnaki's nature. It fits the textual evidence most directly, but demands we overturn consensus understanding of human civilization's independent development. It explains the technical sophistication, the transmission emphasis, the procedural obsession, the consistency across time and geography. But it requires evidence beyond the texts themselves, archaeological, genetic, geological evidence of who the Anunnaki were, where they came from, where they went. Each reading has strengths. Each has limitations. The pure mythology reading is safest, but leaves questions unanswered. The encoded wisdom reading is intriguing, but unstable. Why maintain encoding indefinitely? The historical documentation reading fits the text best, but requires claims that overturn scholarly consensus. Perhaps the truth combines elements. Perhaps the Sumerians did receive advanced knowledge from somewhere, earlier civilization, forgotten technological period, external contact, and wrapped that knowledge in mythological framework during transmission. Perhaps the gods were metaphors for real teachers whose names and origins were lost, but whose teachings survived. Perhaps religion emerged as half memory, half interpretation, preserving something real while misunderstanding its nature. Or perhaps the Sumerians documented exactly what they experienced, and we lack the framework to understand what they meant. The evidence sits in the vaults. The tablets remain. The cuneiform doesn't change its claims. And the question persists, why did the Anunnaki create religion? If they existed, if the texts document rather than invent, then the answer is in the pattern. Religion was infrastructure for distance management. It allowed advanced beings to withdraw from daily administration while maintaining overall authority through intermediaries, through procedures, through structures that continued operating without requiring constant presence. Religion wasn't about controlling humanity. It was about enabling humanity to function with less direct oversight. The framework granted partial autonomy, kings administering, priests operating, humans wielding some me, while maintaining connection to the source. It was delegation, not domination. But speculation reaches its limit. What remains is the texts, the questions they raise, and the silence they meet with. The question that remains. The vault is cool. The clay is old. CBS 10673 sits in its archival box, catalogued, protected, preserved. Outside the museum, cars pass. People walk. The city hums with life. Inside, in the quiet, the fragment rests. Its cuneiform sharp despite 4 millennia, its documentation still readable, still raising the same question it raised for those who first pressed these signs into wet clay. Why create religion? If the Anunnaki were myth, the question is how that myth served social function. The answer, as all mythology serves, binding communities, explaining natural phenomena, justifying social hierarchies. This is the consensus answer. It's probably correct. Most human religious systems emerged this way, gradually, organically, shaped by cultural needs and environmental pressures. But the Sumerian system has a different character. It's so systematic, so precise, so consistently maintained across so many generations with so little variation, as if designed rather than evolved, as if implemented rather than emerged. And the texts themselves insist this came from elsewhere, this was taught, this was established by beings who then withdrew, leaving humanity to maintain what they'd begun. Perhaps that insistence is the myth. Perhaps the Sumerians needed to believe civilization came from gods because accepting it came from ordinary humans was too mundane. Perhaps the precision was how they honoured tradition, and the systematization emerged gradually, later generations projecting it backward. Or perhaps they wrote what they witnessed. Perhaps beings came, taught, established systems, withdrew, and left records of the encounter. Perhaps those records degraded into mythology only later, after the direct memory faded, after the knowledge became tradition, after the procedures became ritual, after the documentation became legend. We stand at the end of a long transmission chain, 42 centuries from the baking of CBS 10673, 50 centuries from Sumerian civilization's height, 60 or more from its origins. The signal has degraded. The context has been lost. We read the words, but may miss their meaning. We see the procedures, but may not understand their purpose. What remains certain is this: the Sumerians built something extraordinary. Cities rising on the flat plain, irrigation systems channeling 2 great rivers, writing systems preserving thought across time, mathematical systems calculating celestial movements, legal systems adjudicating disputes, architectural systems raising temples toward heaven, administrative systems managing complex civilization, and threading through it all, binding it together, a religious framework that defined how heaven and earth connected, how gods and humans related, how cosmic order was maintained through human action. If that framework was invented, it demonstrates stunning human creativity, building meaning from nothing, structure from chaos, civilization from mud and water and reed. If that framework was transmitted, it demonstrates something else, that someone once knew more than we've assumed, taught what they knew, and left us maintaining systems whose origins we've forgotten. The question doesn't resolve. The evidence permits multiple readings. The tablets sit silent in their vaults, speaking when read, but never explaining themselves beyond what the cuneiform says. Perhaps the question isn't meant to resolve. Perhaps its value is in the asking, in the slow consideration, as breath deepens and thoughts drift, of what it means that humans 4,000 years ago documented such elaborate systems and claimed they came from beyond. Whether they were right or wrong, their testimony survives. Whether we believe or doubt, their question echoes. Where does civilization come from? Who taught the first teachers? What happens when knowledge passes through catastrophe? How do we maintain what we didn't create? These are sleep questions. Questions without answers that settle. Questions that open rather than close. Questions that linger at the edge of consciousness, neither urgent nor dismissible, present but patient. The vault is quiet. The city outside continues. The ancient clay rests in its modern protection. And somewhere in the space between what we know and what we wonder, the possibility remains. Perhaps we've been operating systems we don't fully understand, maintaining procedures whose origins lie deeper than we've admitted, stewarding knowledge that came from somewhere else, from someone else, from a time we no longer remember, but whose traces persist in the oldest texts humanity preserved. The question that remains is whether that matters, whether knowing the origin changes the present, whether understanding the design affects its operation, whether the answer, if we found it, would be comfort or crisis. For now, there's only the evidence, the tablets, the temples eroded to platforms beneath desert sand, the cuneiform pressed into clay by long dead hands, the procedures described with precision, the system documented with care, the insistence across thousands of texts that this came from the Anunnaki, and the silence across thousands of years about what that means. The question remains. The night deepens. The breath slows. And in the quiet space where inquiry dissolves into rest, perhaps that's enough to have asked, to have considered, to have touched the edge of mystery and acknowledged it remains mysterious still. Sleep well. The questions will be here when you wake.